Mr. Warren's Profession, Aubrey and Lindsey, Book 1, by Sebastian Nothwell. Narrated by Gary Furlong. Chapter 1. Manchester, England, 1891. "Warren? What the devil are you doing here at this hour?" The voice, though gentle, interrupted the distant drone of the factory like a thunderclap. Aubrey Warren snapped to attention. His pen slashed a line through a column in his ledger as he whipped his head up to regard the man in the doorway. The hallway outside the office remained dark despite the weak sunrise fighting its way through the Manchester smog. Yet Aubrey recognised the barrel-shaped body perched on spindly legs as Mr. Jennings, mill manager. "Sorry, sir," said Aubrey. His broken nib dripped ink between the pages of the ledger. Aubrey whipped out an old rag, already more ink than cloth, to blot the mess. Mr. Jennings shut the office door and hung up his hat, exposing his balding pate. "What time did you come in?" he said, approaching Aubrey's desk. 5 o'clock? 4? Aubrey held his tongue. Mr. Jennings sighed. "Oh, you never went home, did you, Warren?" "There was work to be done, sir." "Work ought to be done during office hours." Mr. Jennings clasped his hands behind his back and bent at the waist to peer down at Aubrey's desk. "That's Smith's ledger, isn't it? Why are you working through the night in another man's ledger, Warren? Sabotage, perhaps? Should I fear a mutiny?" From any other man, the stream of questions would be an inquisition, but hearing them in Mr. Jennings's resigned tone, Aubrey didn't feel attacked, only duly chastised. "No, sir." "Then Smith has begged you to correct his work for him?" "Not so much begged as commanded," Aubrey thought. Aloud he said, "Smith's work is perfectly adequate, sir." "Then why are you here?" "To confirm its adequacy." Mr. Jennings didn't bother to pretend he believed him. "I'd send you home, Warren, but I'm afraid I cannot spare you today." Aubrey awaited further explanation. Mr. Jennings offered up nothing more, merely ambled away behind the door of his own inner office, set apart from the common clerks. Aubrey returned to Smith's ledger. Smith himself strolled in at 8:15. While not a notably athletic specimen, he looked like Hercules next to Aubrey. Aubrey's flat, dark hair was a mere shadow of the light brown locks Smith waxed into waves. Smith's bright copper eyes far outshone the black-brown of Aubrey's, and Smith's cheeks flushed warm and pink with life, while Aubrey's sunk into a colour indistinguishable from the parchment he worked on. Though they were of a like age, only Smith carried the aura of youthful vitality. Aubrey, meanwhile, seemed to have died at 20 or so and somehow kept on with the bookkeeping. Aubrey cast his own attention back down to his desk and tried to ignore the sounds of Smith tossing his hat and jacket onto their respective pegs. The sound of Smith's footsteps coming closer proved more difficult to disregard. The sound of Smith's voice, impossible. "What, still at it, Warren?" Smith clapped a hand onto Aubrey's shoulder. Aubrey watched in vain as the tail end of his 7 veered off into the next row. He lifted his eyes from the ruined page. So it would seem. Smith clucked his tongue in mock reproof, and much to Aubrey's relief wandered off to his own desk, seeming content to let his ledger remain in Aubrey's more capable hands. Aubrey knew better than to attempt to return it to him. Left up to Smith, the entire mill complex would crumble around their ears. No sooner had Smith sat down than Mr. Jennings reappeared. "Interesting news, boys," he said. Aubrey snapped to attention. Smith deigned to remove his feet from his desk. Mr. Jennings fixed the same placid look on both. "The mill is changing hands," he continued. "Our new owner, Mr. Althorp, requests a tour of the property. Today." Short notice, yes, but Mr. Jennings ran a tight ship. Whoever this Mr. Althorp was, he would find no fault in the rock mill, not if Aubrey had any say in the matter. "We've an hour and 3/4 to prepare," Mr. Jennings went on. "Make yourselves ready." Aubrey surreptitiously rubbed the stubble on his chin. Mr. Jennings returned to his office. The instant the door clicked shut, Smith put his heels back on his desk. Aubrey hoped he'd have the sense to adopt a more professional posture before Mr. Althorp arrived. Not that Aubrey looked any better himself. A prickly jaw, ink-stained knuckles, and yesterday's shirt did not add up to a respectable appearance. Nothing could be done about the shirt. He wouldn't have enough time to walk home and back, to say nothing of what the sweat and smog of the return journey would do to a fresh shirt. His unshaven face was another matter. Aubrey closed Smith's ledger and opened the bottom right drawer of his desk. There, under a ream of parchment, sat a battered cigar box. Its contents rattled as he tucked it under his arm. Without a word, he deposited Smith's ledger beside Smith's ankles and walked out the door. The office stood apart from the main body of the mill on the other side of a cobblestoned courtyard, with a water pump centred between them. Most of the water drawn from it went to thirsty mill workers. Several such men gathered around it now, talking amongst themselves. They fell silent as Aubrey approached. "Good morning," said Aubrey. A couple of the men responded in kind. After that, the group as a whole seemed to forget the oddity of a clerk coming down to mingle with the rest of the workforce. They moved back a bit to let him at the pump and struck up their conversation again, as if he'd never arrived. Aubrey took no offence. He had little practice in the art of conversation and work to do besides. Out of his cigar box came a plain clay bowl with multiple hairline fissures running down its sides. Aubrey filled it with water, then stripped off his jacket, waistcoat and shirt, and draped them over the pump handle. This caught the workers' attention again. The youngest one, a lad of 14 or so, pointed at Aubrey's pale, bare chest, but caught a slap on the back of his head from one of his elders before he could open his mouth to heckle. The rest of the workers turned back to their business. Aubrey assumed they hoped ignoring him would make him stop being odd in their yard and go away. He wondered how their reaction might differ if they knew he hadn't been born to the middle-class status of a clerk. If they realised his origins were far lower than that, even lower than their own. Still, any shame he felt at revealing his naked flesh was nothing compared to the shame he would feel if he made no effort to appear respectable in front of the mill's new owner. To that end, he returned to his cigar box and drew out a bar of soap and a razor. Aubrey knew his own face well enough to shave without a looking-glass. Today he used double his usual allotment of soap, all the while trying not to think about the cost, and pulled the blade over his cheeks with especial care. Once done, he washed his face and hands, beat the soot from his clothes, dressed and returned to the office. He could still feel the mill hand's stares on the back of his neck as he left the yard. He stepped through the office doorway 9:15. Contrary to his expectation, Smith had moved in the interim. He'd draped a handkerchief over his eyes. It fluttered in time with his snores. Aubrey, knowing Smith would accomplish as much asleep as he would awake, didn't bother trying to rouse him. Instead, he returned the cigar box to its drawer and took out his own ledger. He had 3/4 of an hour until Mr. Althorp arrived. He intended to make them count. Mr. Jennings re-emerged at 10:10. He took in the sight of the sleeping Smith, then turned to Aubrey with a finger pressed against his inexpressive lips. Aubrey followed him out of the office in silence. "Sir," said Aubrey as they walked across the yard towards the mill. "Shouldn't Smith be present as well?" "I find the more industrious employee makes a better impression," said Mr. Jennings. Aubrey thought it might have been a compliment. Lindsey Althorp boarded the morning train from Wiltshire to Manchester. One short tour of the textile mill to show his father he'd grown into sedate and responsible manhood, university or no university. Then he could catch the very next train back to the country house and get on with the urgent business of reading the latest Strand. He would have brought the magazine with him, but reading on the train made him ill. Even without it, he had plenty to occupy his mind. He'd never owned a mill before, which lent a novel air to the day's excursion. His elder sister, Rowena, had predicted over breakfast he'd grow bored with it before the week was out. Because of this, she had not been invited along. He'd won the mill off Clarence in a card game down at the club last week. He'd had every intention of giving Clarence the chance to win it back, but Clarence had declined all invitations to play. 7 days later, Lindsey supposed it was his to keep. Lindsey had never visited Manchester before. He knew people there, or rather, he knew people who did business there, or who hired people to do business there for them. But the city itself, boasting no literary significance or sporting society, at least none Lindsey had ever heard of, did not play to his interests. So Manchester had remained a dull, smoggy haze in his imagination. But as he stepped off the train in Manchester Central, the dull haze sprang to life with a clang that knocked Lindsey's preconceptions right out of his head. Manchester wasn't so downtrodden and depressed as Dickens and Gaskell had led him to believe. The streets surged with crowds to match any in London. The air rang with the constant echo of rattling steam engines and screaming factory whistles. The smog of 1,000 busy chimneys swirled around the hansom cab carrying Lindsey from the train station to his new mill. It would take more than a good brushing to clean the grime of Manchester from Lindsey's blue frock coat, but that was his valet's problem. Rather than concern himself with it, he sat back in idle contentment to watch the industrious world go by. When the cab pulled into the cobblestone courtyard of Rook Mill, Lindsey found himself disappointed. Clarence Rook, the dear old schoolmate who'd given up the mill, was a man of elegance, with a subtle yet stylish wardrobe and an impeccable eye for everything from silk waistcoats to horses. The mill's architecture reflected none of Clarence's good taste. Of course, Clarence hadn't built it. His paternal grandfather had designed and commissioned the mill complex, and it seemed the old man's vision had been red brick, as both construction material and inspiration for the shape of the mill complex as a whole, and its individual buildings. Straight lines and right angles dominated the mill, broken up by chimneys spewing dark plumes into the low-hanging smog. A massive clock tower rose up beyond the roof of the largest and most central of the buildings, likewise plain. Lindsey, who'd hoped for something more in the neo-Gothic line, withheld a sigh. Modern architecture might be good for business, he thought, but it did nothing for his soul. The hansom stopped in front of the largest building. Lindsey stepped down into the courtyard and encountered a bizarre phenomenon. The cobblestones vibrated. He took an experimental step forward. The vibration continued. Lindsey suspected it might bear some relation to the faint roar coming from behind the tall, black, rectangular double doors of the mill. He looked up at these doors just as the one on the left opened, allowing more of the roar to escape. A voice projected over the rumbling. "Mr. Althorp!" Lindsey stepped closer. 2 men stood in the doorway. The one who'd spoken looked the same age as Lindsey's father, dressed in a grey suit which matched his grizzled mutton chops. His round bulk kept the second, smaller man in shadow. "You have the advantage of me," said Lindsey, sweeping his top hat from his head. "Mr. Jennings, sir," the grey man said with a deferential nod. "Mill manager." "A pleasure," said Lindsey, not entirely sincere. From architecture to staff, this adventure was proving underwhelming. If Mr. Jennings noticed, he disguised it well. "My assistant clerk," Mr. Jennings said, moving aside to let the other man into Lindsey's line of vision. "Mr. Warren." Lindsey stared. Mr. Warren, appearing scarcely older than Lindsey himself, stood a good head shorter. His heart-shaped face held a small, sharp nose, Cupid's bow lips, and a spellbinding pair of large, dark, half-lidded eyes. He wore a black wool suit, which offset the china white of his skin, as much as it matched the ebony gleam of his hair, combed back to reveal a high, intelligent forehead. "Sir," said Mr. Warren, in a tone as mechanical as their surroundings. He gave Lindsey a clockwork-sharp nod. Lindsey hardly heard him, though his hindbrain noted the gesture and may have responded in kind. Alternatively, he might have continued staring at Mr. Warren with parted lips and furrowed brow. He couldn't say for certain. "Mr. Althorp?" said Mr. Jennings. "Yes," Lindsey replied. a half-second before he redirected his gaze away from Mr. Warren. "If I may," said Mr. Jennings, standing back with an invitational gesture. Mr. Warren mirrored him in silence. Lindsey stepped up to the mill and the tour began. From outside the ground had vibrated. Inside the floorboards quaked with tenfold violence. The muffled roar multiplied into the endless, thundering bellow of Leviathan rumbling through the deep. It deafened Lindsey. He hoped the effect was temporary. The mill interior loomed larger than any ballroom he'd ever danced in. Clattering machines filled it from wall to wall. Lindsey couldn't tell where one ended and another began. To his eyes it seemed an Ouroboros of cotton and steel. Levers and wheels zipped back and forth, and 1,000 criss-crossed threads trembled in the air. Every motion in the mill produced a fresh burst of lint. This lint floated through the room like a flurry of snowflakes. Lindsey inhaled a speck of it quite by accident and coughed. He couldn't hear his cough. He could barely feel it reverberate through his own rib cage over the clamour of the room. Dozens of women and girls tended to the mechanical labyrinth, reaching in with narrow arms and small hands to adjust this or that, then retreating fractions of a second before steel came crashing down where their limbs had been. These constant brushes with disfigurement, or worse, didn't seem to alarm them. Lindsey turned to Mr. Jennings to remark upon this, but found him already in the midst of speech, crisply gesticulating at various points of interest throughout the room. For all Lindsey could hear him, he may as well have merely mouthed his words. "Pardon!" Lindsey half-shouted. Then, realizing half measures would get him nowhere, he repeated his inquiry at a bellow. Neither attracted Mr. Jennings's attention. Before Lindsey lowered himself to tapping Mr. Jennings's shoulder like an impertinent schoolboy, Mr. Warren's pale fingers reached out and performed the service for him. Mr. Jennings gave a start and followed Mr. Warren's nod to Lindsey. Mr. Jennings said a word. Given the context and the shape his mouth formed, Lindsey determined it to be, "Sir?" Lindsey repeated his question. To his amazement, Mr. Jennings heard him and rattled off an answer. Lindsey couldn't hear a word. Still, he nodded as though he understood. Mr. Jennings started down an aisle of the labyrinth. Lindsey looked to Mr. Warren for a cue, and for the simple pleasure of looking at Mr. Warren. Mr. Warren remained stone-faced, no, marble-faced, Lindsey decided, like Michelangelo's David, as he waved Lindsey onward. Lindsey followed Mr. Jennings. Mr. Warren took up the rear, much to Lindsey's consternation. Mr. Jennings attempted to draw Lindsey's attention to various points of interest, shouting over the constant rattle. Lindsey caught none of it. He considered turning to Mr. Warren again, under the pretense of asking for clarification. But then Mr. Jennings wanted to show him the winding threads and the rolling wheels, and 100 other dreary things that weren't Mr. Warren's face. Mr. Warren remained behind them, or so Lindsey assumed. He dearly wished to turn around and confirm it. But Mr. Jennings pointed to the rotating shafts and belts suspended from the ceiling, forcing Lindsey to tilt his head up and behold them. Like Orpheus and Eurydice, Lindsey thought, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. Forbidden from gazing upon Mr. Warren, he could only trust Mr. Warren, yet followed him. He wondered if Mr. Warren could find the parallels as amusing as he did. Likely Mr. Jennings would not. He didn't seem the poetic sort. But Mr. Warren was undoubtedly poetic. Surely a marvellous literary mind philosophized underneath his ivory brow. Multitudes of mythological references must teem behind those shadowed eyes. And his mysterious silence, why, he was clearly deep in thought as far beyond the earthly realm of the mill as Lindsey himself. This state of affairs continued up all 4 floors of the mill, down the steel spiral staircase and out the same doors they had entered hours earlier. Lindsey's whole skull rang in the absence of the industrial roar. He turned back to the mill and, much to his relief, found Mr. Warren standing there, with Mr. Jennings beside him.
"Have you any further inquiry, sir?"
said Mr. Jennings. At last, an opportunity to break Mr. Warren's silence. Lindsey would have delighted to hear in the relative quiet of the yard the sound of whatever voice might issue from Mr. Warren's beautiful bow-shaped lips. "How many persons does the mill employ?" asked Lindsey, his attention fixed on Mr. Warren's perfect yet immobile face. But Mr. Warren's shadowed eyes flicked away to meet Mr. Jennings. And it was the latter who replied.
166 at present, sir."
Lindsey made a second attempt. "And when was the factory complex built?"
1844, sir."
Mr. Jennings again. Lindsey racked his brains for a question which Mr. Warren could answer, but Mr. Jennings could not. At length his mind produced a suitably subtle solution. He withheld a triumphant grin and asked, "How long have you been employed here, Mr. Jennings?"
"Some 26 years, sir."
Lindsey hummed thoughtfully, then offered up the pièce de résistance of his cunning plan. "And you, Mr. Warren?" Mr. Warren's dark eyes widened. He looked to Mr. Jennings, who raised his eyebrows. Mr. Warren's expression flattened again. It turned back to Lindsey. 8 years, sir, he said. Lindsey ruminated on this new information. He supposed the earliest a lad could start clerking in a textile mill would be 15. Add 8 to that, and Mr. Warren was at least 23 to Lindsey's 21. What he might do with that information, Lindsey couldn't say. But it was more of Mr. Warren than he'd known 5 minutes ago, so he cherished it.
"Was there anything else you wanted, sir?"
said Mr. Jennings. An excellent question. From Mr. Jennings, nothing. From Mr. Warren, everything. However, the two men had one thing in common. "May I see your offices?" asked Lindsey. After a good 3 seconds' pause, Mr. Jennings replied,
"The offices, sir?"
"Yes," said Lindsey. "I presume you and Mr. Warren clerk in an office?"
"Of course, sir," said Mr. Jennings. "Warren."
Mr. Warren nodded briskly and dashed off, the precise opposite of the outcome Lindsey had hoped for.
"If you'll follow me, sir,"
said Mr. Jennings. Lindsey did his best to disguise his crushing disappointment. The new owner was insane. This was the conclusion Aubrey drew as he sprinted across the yard. Mr. Jennings, ambling along on his twiggy legs, would slow Mr. Althorp down, but even so, Aubrey estimated he had mere minutes to get the mill office in order. He threw the door open and faced his first obstacle. Smith, still at his desk, still asleep. Aubrey stopped in the doorway. The sound of the door alone ought to have woken him, and yet here they were. "Smith," said Aubrey. Smith snored. Aubrey didn't have time for this. "Smith!" he said again, louder. Smith smacked his lips. Aubrey dared not shout. Mr. Althorp might arrive any moment now, and it wouldn't do for him to overhear Aubrey berating his fellow clerk. He considered chucking the apparently comatose Smith out the window, but that was mere fancy. Smith's broad shoulders would never fit through the window frame. Besides, Aubrey didn't think he could lift him. Smith mumbled something in his sleep. Aubrey looked over the office for a solution and came across a crumpled paper ball by Smith's wastebasket. Having missed the bin, it flew a truer course to Smith's forehead. Smith started awake.
"What?"
"Mr. Althorp is here," said Aubrey.
"Already?"
Smith rubbed his face and looked to the clock over the door. "Yes," said Aubrey. "He wishes to see the office. Mr. Jennings is leading him here as we speak."
"Oh, splendid,"
said Smith mildly. Aubrey didn't reply, being far too busy emptying waste paper bins into the corner stove where yesterday's coals still smouldered. The papers flared up. An ember landed on Aubrey's thigh. He hurried to pat it out and brush it away, muttering oaths under his breath. A cursory examination showed minimal damage to his trousers. The ember hadn't stayed long enough to burn, and the black wool helped disguise charcoal smears. Still, Aubrey would know the blemish existed, and the knowledge had already begun driving him mad. Smith wasn't helping. "So," said Smith, who remained seated at his desk, though he had finally put his heels back on the floor where they belonged. "What's Althorp like, then?" Based on first impressions, Aubrey had determined several facts regarding Mr. Althorp. First, he was young, much younger than Aubrey had expected, though according to rumour the previous owner, Mr. Rook, was of a like age. Mr. Althorp was also aristocratic, judging by his crisp public school accent and the long aquiline features that seemed to come standard with the peerage. Such a lineage might explain his peculiar mannerisms, the staring, the selective hearing loss, the general air of sleepwalking. "Warren," said Smith, "are you deaf?" "Tall," said Aubrey. "What?" "He's quite tall," Aubrey elaborated. In fact, he thought Mr. Althorp bore strong resemblance to a lamp-post, a tall, narrow pole topped with bright blonde curls like a yellow gas flame. "That's all you know?" Aubrey opened his mouth to retort. A muffled voice outside the office cut him off. He rushed to the door. In that instant, the door swung inward. Aubrey scampered out of the way to admit Mr. Jennings, who held the door open for Mr. Althorp. The look on Mr. Althorp's face suggested he saw something very different from the dreary chamber Aubrey toiled in 6½ days per week. Indeed, according to his awestruck expression, one might suppose he'd entered a great palace or cathedral of ancient times. Smith had jumped up from his chair when the door opened and stood at the ready beside his desk. It took some time for Mr. Althorp to notice him. It might never have happened at all if Mr. Jennings hadn't intervened. "My other assistant, Mr. Smith." "How do you do, sir?" said Smith, in the smooth tone of an actor reciting from memory. He played the part of a contented servant well, Aubrey thought, when he bothered with the effort. Mr. Althorp didn't respond, his attention focused on the lint and soot-smeared window on the opposite wall. When he did turn in Smith's direction, rather than look Smith in the eye, his gaze dropped down to Smith's desk, and then wandered over to Aubrey's far cleaner one. "And who works where?" said Mr. Althorp to no one in particular. "I set up shop here, sir," said Smith. He rapped his knuckles against his stained blotter, then jerked his chin towards Aubrey's desk. "Warren sits there." Mr. Althorp's manner transformed from bored to bright in an instant. "Does he indeed?" Aubrey tensed. Mr. Althorp approached his desk, folded his hands behind his back, and bent forward at the waist to examine Aubrey's work. He stood in silence for a long, uncomfortable minute, then moved a bit to the left and cocked his head to one side, inspecting the desk from all angles as if it were an artifact of some long-deceased civilization which he couldn't touch for fear it would crumble to dust. Aubrey resisted the impulse to offer Mr. Althorp a magnifying glass. "And what do you do here, Mr. Warren?" Aubrey restrained his expression of surprise to a raised eyebrow, which he wrestled back into its original position post-haste. "I assist Mr. Jennings in keeping records of our raw material input, finished material output, orders filled, the accounts to which we sell, the persons we employ, and the expenses incurred in maintaining the mill. Mr. Smith does the same," he added hastily. But Mr. Althorp's attention remained fixed on Aubrey. "Could you furnish me with a copy of these records?" It took Aubrey a half-second to swallow his shock. Mr. Jennings, ever the consummate professional, required no such pause to collect himself before he cut in. "All of them, sir?" Mr. Althorp pursed his lips. Aubrey, refusing to believe anyone could give serious consideration to such a request, held his breath. "No," Mr. Althorp said. "Just the last month's will do." Smith made a choking noise. Aubrey shot him a disapproving glare. Went unnoticed. "Of course, sir," said Mr. Jennings. "Mr. Warren will be delighted to copy them out for you." Aubrey, who'd assumed the task would fall to him the moment Mr. Althorp had suggested it, put on a polite smile for his benefit. He couldn't imagine it looked at all sincere. But true delight lit up Mr. Althorp's face. "Would you really?" he said, looking between Aubrey and Mr. Jennings as if he couldn't believe his good fortune. To see his grin, one would think they'd offered him a stable full of fine racing horses, or whatever it was rich young toffs desired most. Aubrey didn't pretend to know. Regardless, Mr. Althorp's visage glowed almost as bright as his hair as he declared, "Splendid!" The corner of Mr. Jennings's mouth twitched. Behind Mr. Althorp's back, Smith covered his mouth as faint hiccups fought their way out of his throat. Fortunately, Mr. Althorp continued to not pay him the slightest attention. "They should be ready by the end of next week," Mr. Jennings continued. "We'll have them delivered to your residence." "No need for that," said Mr. Althorp. "I'll just drop by again to retrieve them." Mr. Jennings betrayed his astonishment with a slow blink. "Very well, sir. Will that be all?" Mr. Althorp's smile dimmed a little. His eyes flicked over to Aubrey just long enough for Aubrey to realise how astonishingly blue they were, like pure indigo dye. Before Aubrey could recover his senses enough to smile or bow or do anything intelligent, Mr. Althorp spoke. "Of course," he said, as if in answer to Mr. Jennings's question. Then he added, "Good day, Mr. Warren." Aubrey couldn't stop his eyebrows from shooting up to his hairline, but he managed to echo Mr. Althorp's sentiment aloud nonetheless. Mr. Althorp beamed at him. For a moment it seemed as though Smith would be forgotten again, but Mr. Althorp turned and offered him the same words of parting. Smith responded with a bow deep enough for Aubrey to suspect mockery in the gesture. If Mr. Althorp noticed, he took no offence. Mr. Jennings led Mr. Althorp out to his waiting hansom cab. Smith showed restraint for once in all the years Aubrey had known him, and waited until they were out of earshot before he spoke. "What do you think, then?" said Smith. "Daft or just stupid?" Aubrey feigned hearing loss as he returned to his desk and started copying out a month's worth of accounts. With his head full of numbers, it would be far easier to forget the sight of those blue eyes.